So good afternoon, everyone. It's my absolute delight to introduce this afternoon two very talented Hispanic writers, Alex Viasante and Jenny Torres Sanchez. Now, Alex Viasante was born in New Jersey. She is the daughter of Uruguayan immigrant parents. She is not only a talented writer or novelist, but also an artist. She earned a BFA in painting and an MA in combined media. I think that's quite admirable. Her novel, The Grief Keeper, is her first, but I'm sure many readers out there, including myself, are hoping it is not her last. She currently resides in Pennsylvania with her family. And our second author, Jenny Torres Sanchez, was born in Brooklyn, New York. She is the daughter of Central American parents. Her father is Salvadoran and her mother is Guatemalan. This is not her first novel, one we're reading here, which is We Are Not From Here. She's also written The Fall of Innocence, Death, Dickinson, and The Demented Life of Frenchie Garcia. It's a real treat to have you both here. And both of you have written really powerful novels that dig into the question of what refugees are forced to give up for a chance to settle in our country. In both cases, your novels consider specifically the hardships Central American youth confront as they seek to escape gang-related violence in Central America, in one case, El Salvador, in another, Guatemala. You both present us with characters who face likely death in their home countries were they to return at the hands of local gang members. And in this way, the United States is really envisioned by the characters in both of your novels, We Are Not From Here and The Grief Keeper, as a place of sanctuary and escape from the violence that threatens them at home. Yet, in both cases, young asylum seekers first experience the United States through incarceration. Now, while The Grief Keeper has some science fiction and young romance elements, the book ultimately asks readers to consider what are asylum seekers and refugees willing to do to find sanctuary in our borders. The novel centers around a new technology that can transfer grief from one person to another. In the novel, a teen asylum seeker agrees to take on the grief of a very wealthy US American teen who has suffered the loss of her twin brother. The novel shows this young Salvadoran protagonist, Marisol, agreeing to take on physically and emotionally crippling grief and depression in the hopes of providing herself and her younger sister a chance at asylum. This novel really brings up some important questions, ethical questions, about what our nation's asylum and refugee policies can force the desperate to endure. Whereas We Are Not From Here provides us with an intensely dramatic and emotive examination of three young teens' harrowing journey from Barrios, Guatemala to the United States. The trio of friends, two boys and a girl, are fleeing the grip of a local gang leader who has unwillingly begun to pull them into his fold. Torres Sanchez incorporates magical realism to emphasize the dangers these young protagonists are running from and also the perils of the journey, which costs one of the three their lives and nearly causes the death of the other two as well. This novel highlights both the generosity and kindness these Central Americans are provided by some in Mexico, but it also looks squarely at the real threats migrants face riding atop train cars, including the risk of being trampled by the train, being arrested by corrupt Mexican officials, kidnapped, raped, or murdered by narcos and gangsters. The arrival to the United States for the two young surviving protagonists, Pequeña and Pulga, means safety. But in both cases, the children that arrive in the United States are not the same that left Guatemala. The journey strips them of a close friend and arguably the childhood enthusiasm and optimism. Please join me in welcoming our two guests, Alex Viasante and Jenny Torres Sanchez. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yay.
We're so happy to be here. Thank you.
Applause. Thank you, and thank you for that amazing introduction, Carmen.
I know we're done here, right? That's it. Thank you and good night.
That was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you.
So a couple of days ago, Jenny and I know each other in our author and friend life anyway. So we were thrilled to know that we would be doing this together. And we got together a couple of days ago to talk about how we would do a little bit of a presentation, a little bit about us and our books and what they're about, a little deeper than what Carmen just did, and then really leave it up to any questions that you all have about, you know, if there's a specific field of study that you're interested in, or that you want sort of the children's author perspective on. We're happy to do that, or just talk about a lot of the issues that our books cover. So I think if it's okay with you, Jenny, I'll turn it over to you first, because the way that our child protagonists start this journey is sort of like our books make the two halves of that journey, starting with where they are at home with Jenny's book, and then ending in where they are in the United States with my book. So if you want to get started with that, Jenny.
Sure. Absolutely. And I love that our books kind of play on each other like that, Alex, or that they show those two sides of the coin. You know, and it's really interesting because this book, I actually started thinking about it and started writing it. You know, Purga came to me probably about, I want to say about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And at the time, the editor that I was with, we pitched this book to her. And she actually wanted me to write it from the perspective of characters who had already arrived in the United States, and then what they faced here, the challenges they faced here once it was done. But to me, this book was always about the journey. You know, what inspired this book was really hearing the stories as we started seeing that flood of unaccompanied minor children at the U.S. southern border, and seeing those stories. And I know that attention was paid to what was happening, but seeing it minimized, seeing it like just these 2-minute kind of clips, or, you know, this article that you could scroll through on Twitter. And I just really felt this need to give a story like that of what children were really enduring and what was propelling them to come to the US southern border. I felt it needed room to breathe, and I felt it needed space, and I felt it needed the honor of full, you know, full attention from the moment, from being in their hometown and seeing the beauty that lives there, right? Because I think a lot of people forget about the beauty that is left behind when children and when migrants are seeking asylum. Letting the reader be in that space with them, and then seeing how it begins to unfold, seeing how the danger creeps up, and how you can really, or these children find themselves in it very quickly, and it becomes unmanageable very quickly. Because I think that is what is very true to what is happening in Central America. You know, things happen really quickly from one day to the next, and you can find yourself in this kind of life and death situation from one day to the next. So that's really what I wanted to bring forth. So, like I said, the editor was like, but I want this story when they arrive. And I said, well, that's not the story. The story is the journey, the whole journey, and everything that happens beforehand, because that's the story that I want to tell. And I think that's a story that often gets ignored. And so I ended up writing a whole other book in the meantime, because, you know, that editor, that wasn't what she was looking for. And then I started kind of worrying, well, maybe this type of book starting in Guatemala is not going to interest anybody. It's not the story that anybody wants to read, which was heartbreaking to me. But, you know, it was the reality that I felt I was facing in publishing. So I started writing this other book, and that editor didn't want that book either. So we pitched it to another editor who ended up getting, you know, buying my new book. And then I worked with her. So this book about my 3 teens was on the back burner. And it was haunting me. It was wanting to be written. And even though I worked on this other book, and then I had an idea for another book, and my editor was going to buy that one, this book kept calling to me. And these teenagers kept calling to me, and I just felt like I had to write it. So I told my my agent, you know, like, hey, I have to write this book, and I keep seeing this in the news, and I just have to write. This is that book that I have to write, and maybe nobody wants it, but in the meantime, I'm not doing anything else until this book is written. And can you pitch it to the editor now? Because I was under contract for another one. And thankfully, Liza said, oh my gosh, absolutely, this book, this is the story I want you to write. So I kept working on it. So that's a little bit about what inspired this book and how it came to be. And, you know, seeing the faces of unaccompanied minors. I'm a mother, and that spoke to me on that level. But also, when I saw the faces of those children, I saw the faces of my family. I saw the faces of my cousins. I saw the faces of my children. You know, I could easily see them there. And so the story was very personal to me, very personal. I've, you know, gone to Guatemala several times, Puerto Barrios, where Pulga and Pequeña and Chico are from. And I've played in those streets. I've hung out on Pulga's patio, you know, because his house is my tia Dora's house in Puerto Barrios. Everything is modeled after her house. His room is the room I slept in while I was there. And Don Felicio's store is actually Doña Margarita's store, where I would go and get soda and snacks during the day, because my mom could see me from El Patio. So it's just a very personal story. And I knew that it would be a hard story to tell, because it requires being honest about the violence that happens in Central America. And I know that that can become a slippery slope. You don't want it to be violence that is gratuitous or for shock value or for, worse of anything, entertainment, right? So, but I knew that I had to be honest about how these teens found themselves in this situation. And because it was so personal, I knew it was a story that I could write with love and with tenderness. And that's, you know, what I brought to the page every time I sat down to write, was the love and tenderness that I have for my family, for my community, for people in Central America that I consider family. And I hope that that comes through with Pulga, Pequeña, and Chico. And it's really also my way of bearing witness to what is happening right now. I feel like history, as we all know, can you know, kind of get watered down and told inaccurately as time progresses. And I felt the need to really document what I was seeing in real time, and bear witness to what was happening, so that later on nobody could say it didn't happen. So it's a little bit about my book. And Alex, of course, you write from the perspective of those teens, or your teen characters being here, and the challenges that they face once they're here, right? Because it's a whole different world.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that the beginning, or some of the sort of impetus for you writing your book was seeing those undocumented kids come, those unaccompanied minors come in like 2013, 14, 15, because I saw the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I had a lot of the same thoughts that you did. I really started to envision it from the other side, because my parents are immigrants, and I started to think about what are the things that people are willing to sacrifice when they make that kind of journey. And one of the things that was so beautiful about your book, and is so true, the beautiful family, the beautiful landscape, the beautiful home communities that they leave. Nobody wants to leave their home. And I think that that's such a simple statement, but it is so profoundly true. And it's something that we don't always understand, and that perspective isn't always given when you're watching it on the news. And I think that I was thinking about, I grew up in a predominantly white suburban area of New Jersey, but right next to part of New Jersey that is very immigrant focused, very Latinx immigrant focused. It's West New York, Guttenberg, Jersey City kind of area, if that means anything to anyone. but the, you know, growing up and seeing all those people working so hard, sending money home, trying to get relatives to come here, sometimes not seeing their own children for years, their own family for years. So that's really where I started, like that idea of sacrifice, and sort of how it takes the person wanting something so desperately and needing something so desperately, and then a society really being willing to burden that person with things that the members of their own society do not burden themselves with. So I'm thinking of, like, in a very really sort of first level thinking, cleaning houses, cutting lawns, childcare. These are the jobs that we give to immigrants in this country because they're the kind of jobs that we don't necessarily want to do. And so that's really where I started thinking about it, that there's a sort of this need that the society has to employ people for the undesirable jobs, for lack of a better term. And there's people who really are willing to make those sacrifices of not seeing their family for years to afford them a better life. So I think that was my starting point. So the Grief Keeper primarily takes place in the United States once Marisol and her sister Gabby have made it here. There are some flashbacks where you see some of what has led them to come here, and some of the things that they've that have happened to their family. And as Jenny said, it sort of happens very quickly, but also it happens over years. So there's sort of this slow slide of circumstance that sort of narrows kids' opportunities in a lot of ways. And it seems like you may, and this has happened to family members and other people, and you try to stay for as long as you can and try to say maybe it'll work out, until it comes to a point where that very quickly where that can no longer happen. So I was thinking about all of those things together, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later, but Jenny and I were talking about how in her book, it's magical realism. In my book, it's speculative fiction. How it's not that great a leap to think of burdening immigrants with undesirable jobs, and also burdening them with those daily microaggressions and racism and all those other things that this society does. But how it's not that big of a step to take to say, well, why don't we actually burden them with depression and grief? And if we had the technology to do such a thing, wouldn't we? And that's sort of the central question in my book. Like, if somebody had the ability to do this, and they could tell themselves the fantasy that it's okay to do this because this person is willing to do this to stay in the country and to get safety for their family, then that is somehow a fair transaction. So I started to play with that idea, and that's where the beginning of this book starts, with Marisol coming to this country with her sister, and agreeing to take part in this clinical trial for a device that transfers grief from one person to another. I just also want to say that one of the biggest things that I wanted to talk about in this book is Marisol's intersecting identities. Because when you have a fully realized person, they're not, of course, one thing. And I'm telling you stuff that you already know, right? This is not rocket science. But I think sometimes in literature, and not only in children's literature, but in adult literature, that a lot of stories about characters that are going through very big things, those characters are flattened into having one or two aspects that are easily understood. But humans aren't like this. Humans are multifaceted, and for a marginalized person like Marisol, she has many intersecting marginalizations that put her in more danger even than she had just one. And it's not just about her being a brown female person from El Salvador, but it's also that she's queer. So all of these things stack on top of her. They're part of her personality, but they make her life in Central America, and then also in the United States, much more difficult. So I really wanted to think about how those intersecting identities would inform her choices. inform some of the things that she sees and what she doesn't see and how she sees herself. And I think that's really, I wanted to give that fullness of character to Marisol, because I think that is true. Like when we're talking about truth, Jenny, and how I feel, I'm going to say this, maybe y'all will disagree with me, but I feel that children's books for children are some of the truest forms of right now, are telling some of the truest things about our world, because I think that children are really on that avant-garde of like what they'll understand about the world. I think that adults, I'm talking about myself too, are like 2 steps behind, and I think children are already right there at the forefront. So that's what I wanted to do with this story of the Grief Keeper. I think I talked enough, right? I talked enough, yeah.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the books that I write are always deal with truth, you know, always. And it's not, I feel like sometimes adults feel that kids can't handle truths, but they are the ones who can best handle the truth. You know,
Absolutely.
It's usually adults who want to change that truth, or want to, in maybe sometimes wanting to soften the truth, although it's not always softening, it's wanting to change it. They do completely change it, you know, but kids are so willing to see the world as it is, and what they want is to engage in conversation about the complexities of our world, you know, about how complicated it can be. And of course, this has to be done at age appropriate levels, you know, but you and I both write YA, and I think that we can begin to deal with some heavy truths at the YA level, and students and teens are totally going to engage in that conversation. And so that's how I approach writing a book is, you know, we are going to have this conversation on the page together.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And that truth is so important too, because not only are we writing for kids outside this experience, we're writing for kids that are inside this experience and have had these experiences in some way, or have family members who have had these experiences. So it's extremely important to be truthful and to not pull any punches while being age appropriate. So yeah. So did you want to talk a little more about using magical realism in your book, which I absolutely adored so much? You know, I told you that. I had the pleasure of reading Jenny's book before it went on, before it was published, and blurbing it too. And it blew my mind in such an incredible way. And I would talk to people about it, and they couldn't get the book yet. And I was like, you know, practically desperate, like, you just don't understand. But the use of magical realism is so, you know, is so evocative and amazing. And it you know, it's like hace compañía, like goes alongside Pequeña in such a beautiful way that I'm like still thinking about it. Anyway, but like the speculative fiction too, it's a tool that we use. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I'm just going to ask Carmen if that's okay, if you wanted to have any questions or anything, or if it's okay if we kind of keep going.
Oh, I just jumped ahead. I'm sorry.
I think it would be great, but if you don't mind just talking a little bit about what magical realism is, because I'm not sure if everybody here is familiar with that.
Okay. Yeah, so I feel like it's always hard to define. You know, it is this magic that is and I'm at a loss for words now, but that is put into the story, right? And it's asking the reader to just follow along, to just accept this to be truth. It's not, you know, it's not a dream. It is like a device that helps, I don't know, to reveal more truth by doing it through this kind of magical way. And I don't know if I'm doing a very poor job of it.
No, I think that's perfect.
I always have trouble kind of defining it. And, you know, I think in some regards it's because it kind of comes to me kind of naturally in terms of like, I think in a lot of images. And so I will just kind of be writing this scene where Pequeña is giving birth to this child. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, why is her mother, you know, washing away in the water? And why is she on a mattress? And why is she now floating away, far away from here? And so I put that in there, and it's like, hey, reader, please come along for the ride. Just please follow me on this, because in this image, in this magic, I'm going to reveal this truth. And the truth is that this is something so huge, so traumatizing, so horrific, that Pequeña has to leave herself. She has to leave. She has to go and float away, out of town, on this mattress, because what is happening here is too big, it's too real, it's too hard. And so then I just kind of saw her doing that. And Pequeña in this book is very much the one who experiences all of that kind of magic, because she has La Bruja, who is her I guess her terrifying guardian angel. Carmen, I don't know if you had more questions, or if I can kind of keep talking a little bit about the magical realism.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add that magical realism is really an element that is developed in Latin American literature. So I just
thank you for saying that.
I just want to throw that out there. And it really has been adopted in Indian and European and other forms, but it is something that is very homegrown to Latin America.
Yeah.
And then actually, if it's okay, I'm going to piggyback, because I have some questions.
Sure.
For you.
Absolutely.
So one of my questions is actually about La Bruja and what exactly her role is in all of this, and why is it that we constantly see her? You're saying she's sort of a guardian angel. My second one, which is also interrelated, is all of your characters' names. Well, they're nicknames.
Mm-hmm.
And we only learn one of the real names. I think the only one we learn is Flor, who's Pequeña. And so I'm just curious why it is that we see them always do these nicknames, and all three of their nicknames essentially mean small, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pequeña, Pulga, Chico.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to kind of touch on that.
Absolutely. So La Bruja came to me when I was 6 years old. And I don't know if it's because we, or I'm going to make a generalization, but in my family, in my culture, we were told these kind of fantastical stories, very much like off the cuff, just kind of like, oh yes, of course you hear that screeching, that's La Llorona or whoever, so those kinds of fantastical elements just seemed very natural to me. And I don't know if that's why, I, as a child, I kind of imagined those things a lot. And La Bruja is actually this kind of terrifying witch who visited me in a dream when I was 6 years old. And it was such a terrifying dream that I kind of always carried her with me. And she's become this element that kind of comes out in my short stories at times, and that I just kind of, have thought about throughout my life. And I was telling one of my friends about that because she read a short story, and I was like, and she's like, oh, I really like this Bruja, and I told her the story. She's like, oh my gosh, La Bruja is your muse. And I said, what? I never thought of her that way, because I do think of her as this terrifying entity, but I also kind of think of her as this this good being as well. And so that's why she comes across the way she does in the book. She is terrifying. She is kind of helping to terrify the bad things in Pequeña's life away, while also kind of holding her and cradling her and trying to lead her to safety. And so that's why she appears to Pequeña in the most harrowing times of her life, when she's a child and almost drowns, when Ray is there, and La Bruja, is able to rid him of Pequeña's room, and then in the desert, when Pequeña is on the brink of death. And the nicknames, Pulga, Chico, and Pequeña, is very much because that's how they feel. They feel small and dismissed and forgotten in the world. And so Pulga is the first one who came to me with this name. And it's because he rides En la Bestia, which is the series of trains that run from southern Mexico all the way to northern Mexico that they're trying to get on so that they can seek asylum. And so I saw him on top of one of those trains because they have to ride on top. And he had his little arms around his legs, and I heard his voice, and he said, I am just a flea on this beast of a train. And I said, oh, and that's the first I knew of Pulga. That's the moment he arrived. And then I was like, what happened to you? What is your story? I need to know how you got on this train. But I remember him telling me he felt, I'm just a flea. And I said, okay, his name is Pulga. And then as the other characters started coming into the story, I knew that they kind of had to have those small names as well, because I wanted the reader, because I trust my reader and because I trust young readers, I wanted my reader to constantly have to contend with the fact that they feel so small. And so their nicknames are that reminder, Chico, Pulga, Pequeña, you don't even get their full names. They just have these little nicknames, which are in my culture, in my family, and they're endearing, but they also are, not quite all that you are. And that's how they feel in the world.
I think it's also interesting, can I step in? Sorry. That each of their names are like, so Pulga is not only a flea and small, but also a pest. And Pequeña means small, but Pequeña is sort of like a diminutive for a girl. So it's like, it takes power away. Mm-hmm. And then Chico is like a funny name for someone who is obviously not Chico. So it's like, they're very like purposeful. It's just, I love it so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if it's okay, I'm going to ask some questions to Alex. Is that
of course? Mm-hmm.
I'm going to switch a little. So I was really fascinated by the cuff, right, that is transferring this grief. And I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about why it is you made it a physical thing, first off. And second off, why it is you made it something that went onto the ankles. Can you kind of dig into that a little?
Yes. So one of the origins of this idea was an article that I read in a science magazine that was about a clinical trial of a wearable, sort of like a Fitbit kind of thing, like a tracker type size thing, that they were going to test to see if it could help alleviate some of the depression, PTSD, anxiety, anger from soldiers coming back from war. So and it would sort of work a little bit on the principle of acupressure. So sort of the same kinds of things that people do for like seasickness or morning sickness. And I thought that's a really interesting idea, a wearable that could alleviate some of these symptoms. And then I just kind of went from there, but what if it didn't just alleviate these symptoms? What if it actually eradicated these symptoms? What would that be like? And then, well, what if it eradicated it, it would have to go somewhere. And it sort of followed on from my earlier train of thought, like, where are the places that we put these burdens in our society? And in a lot of ways, it's to marginalized communities and immigrant communities. So that's sort of the origin of that idea. And I wanted it to be a wearable because I wanted Marisol to be able to choose to put it on or take it off. And for that compulsion of her sense of duty to her family and to her sister, that would be driving her to put it on and take it off. And that when she, in the beginning of, or earlier in the book, when she is having those conversations to try to get Ray to put that cuff on, it sort of is a little bit of a contrast between what she is willing to do and how sort of Ray is not willing to do it and doesn't feel that compulsion because she has sort of the opposite problem. She doesn't want her grief taken away. She doesn't want to be separated from these emotions that she still has about her brother. So I wanted that contrast of who wears it, wants to wear it, can wear it, and who doesn't. And then another layer of that, and having the cuff be on the ankle was really to just echo those images of the home monitoring anklets that a lot of people who have been through detention and are released into a either family or sponsor's care will have to be, it looks like a leg shackle. It's a monitoring device that you are being watched and being accounted and making sure that, and what you have done is the horrible thing that you've done is you've come to this country and asked for safety. which should be a birthright, right? So those were all the things that were in my mind when I was thinking about the construction of the cuff and like how it would work if you could take it off, if, where and on the body would it be and all that kind of stuff.
So I have another question and then I want to open it up. But so one thing that really struck me is that Marisol and Gabi they're running away, right, from their own traumas. And yet Marisol is asked to then take on Ray's traumas. And frankly, you could say that maybe they've suffered equal traumas, or maybe even Marisol has suffered more. Yet Ray is unable to deal with that. And I'm wondering if you are trying to say something there about what it is that children in Central America are forced to have to contend with, which children in the United States generally don't have to, or if there's some other message that you were trying to make with that.
Yes. So what I'm trying to say is a couple of things. First of all, children in a lot of other countries are made into child soldiers, are married at the age of 9, 10, or 11. The value of childhood is very different in other countries. That's like a massive generalization, but that is something that exists. But also in this country, the way we see children, from Black and brown children, and I'm not even talking about immigrant children, even American children, the way we see them, the way that we age them up so that a 16-year-old white girl is seen very differently from a 16-year-old Black girl, and they become more sexualized and they become more savvy, so they can take on more burdens and more adult responsibilities and sort of adult imaginings, for lack of a better word. So I think that I really wanted to talk about how we protect American white childhood, but we don't necessarily protect other childhoods, and that is really hypocritical. So yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you guys for answering 2 of my questions. I have more, but I really want to open it up to other people. I'm not sure if other people have questions that they'd like to ask.
So Carmen, I opened up the chat. So anyone who has a question, but they don't want to feel free necessarily to speak out, you can put it in the chat and we'll be able to see it, or I'll be able to see it and read it out. But really anybody, I'm going to change the view so I can see a gallery view. You can raise your hand too, and we'll try to get to you. Otherwise, we'll just let Jenny and Alex keep talking because we know they will.
We really will.
Question. Bob, you want to unmute yourself?
Okay. Unfortunately, I just got the memo a couple of days ago, and I was only able to get one of the books. And my wife picked it up today, and I was at work. I didn't get a whole chance to read it. But I did read some magical realism books. They were 100 Years of Solitude, and it was by Marquez, right? Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Paula was by Isabel Allende, and Arturo's Island by Elsa Morente. And they were all, I believe they were written in Spanish or Italian first and then translated. And so is magical realism only related to those cultures, or is it possible to have me write a book with magical realism?
I mean, I can just give you my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
And my opinion is that you can absolutely write whatever you want, but it's usually not called magical realism. That magical realism is a term that originates in Latin America and has that sort of cultural connection. Can you write about a bruja or a food that creates magic spells or a bunch of other things like that? Of course you can. But I think that one of the things that Jenny mentioned about magical realism that sort of makes it different from fantasy or writing about a world that is sort of an alternate universe that has magic is that there is no magic system. In magical realism, the world is the world, the real world. it just also has magic. And those two concepts are right side by side. You accept them both the same way. So, but that is only my opinion. Jenny?
Well, I think you can tell who's the more extroverted and who's the more introverted.
Sorry.
But no. I mean, I agree. I think that that's absolutely true. You know, it is something that, like Carmen said before, has its root in Latin American literature, and so it's called magical realism when you don't have that, when you are inserting that magic, but it's alongside the real world, and it's not, you know, based on any kind of system or world building that contains this magic, but it's magic that is just in the real world. But yes, absolutely, like Alex said, you can write whatever you'd like. You know, I think it differentiates a little bit in what you call it and how you approach that magic in your book, and the purpose for putting it in the book or in your writing.
So you don't think it's the language, you know, like the Spanish language has words that I don't think we can translate, you know, into English. And I was just wondering if that, like reading 100 Years of Solitude to me was really, really difficult. I found it to be really frightening in a way.
Well, I mean, I wrote all of mine in English, you know, and
okay.
Yeah. So that's how it came to me, was and actually I could not write this book in Spanish because while I speak it fluently, my writing of Spanish is, you know, on like probably a middle school or early high school level. So I could not write this whole book. It was translated into Spanish. But yeah, but I do, you know, La Bruja is called La Bruja in the English version as well, because those are the, you know, words that I've taken from this language and put into the book.
So
Thank you.
we had a sort of a more of a question that our provost asked Bob. How is La Bruja differentiated from a witch and so many other fictional works that also entail magic? And he thinks maybe, Alex, that you would answer this question, or is there anything more?
I mean, I think going off a little bit of what Bob said about, or was asking about, magical realism, I don't think it necessarily has to do with language, although language informs culture. I think it really has to do with culture. And again, when we're talking about Latin America and Latinidad in general, we're talking about many, many different cultures. Yes, we share some things, but they're different. But there is a sort of an ephemeral, in the air culture that I think is that you grow up with, that maybe someone who isn't Latin American would not recognize, or might seem scary, or might seem unusual. And to us, we're sort of like, that's another Tuesday. You know, it just seems very normal to us. So an example that I can give that isn't, I don't know, if it was in a book, maybe it would be magical realism. But when my children were born, I immediately went and got some red yarn, and I tied a piece of red yarn around their wrist. And I did that without thinking about it. And I didn't think it was weird. I didn't tell anyone, and it wasn't a thing. But that was to guard against mal de ojo. Because that's what we do. That's what we do. Because that's what you do. Just like, you know, just alongside your daily, you buy your diapers, and then you buy your string for the baby, because you know. So that's my approximation. Yeah.
Or we have like different versions of the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. Like you'll hear of a character like El Duende, and it's a little bit different in Salvadoran, how Salvadorans say it or talk about, you know, that folk tale, and a little different from Guatemalan, and a little different from Mexican. But ultimately it's kind of the same thing. So like La Bruja is witch for like all of us, you know, but then it's just like, and it's not specifically like Guatemalan or Salvadoran in this book. It is just whatever I made of it, whatever version of La Bruja that I live with, and that I think of, and that I put in there.
And Danielle is nodding her head. Danielle, do you want me to ask your question, or do you want to ask it? Because it seems like they're addressing this more. Danielle, can you unmute yourself?
I don't know if I need to ask. Well, I mean, my question that I had was, because you said that magical realism was specific to, Hispanic culture, I had never heard of that. I was asking if it was based on like a historical context of like, the presence of Santeria or, brujeria or shamanism. Like what was is it just, part of Hispanic culture to have that kind of magical element, in all of the countries, or is it from, something specific? Like what was the history of that?
Okay, y'all, you heard when Carmen said that I went to art school, right? So I don't actually know the answer to this, but I'm gonna try. So my guess is that it has to do with Latin America's history of colonization, and that when you have an indigenous population, you have an enslaved population that is brought in, and then you have white colonizers, and those three groups and needs and systems of oppression and resistance come together over hundreds of years. And what sort of like what I was saying about it being in the air, that ephemeral, what's left are these systems of survival. So that I belief in magic that made it all the way to Pennsylvania with my kids and a little piece of red string is in my understanding, it would be that is a remnant of a survival mechanism for how you hold on to your existing indigenous culture, hold on to your existing, African culture when you are stolen from your country and made an enslaved person, but have to live in a world that is, this sort of like if you go to a lot of countries in Central and South America, the capitals look like little Europes. Their buildings are like little Europes. It's a little weird. It doesn't really belong because the environment and the weather and all those are different, and and the animals are different and all this kind of stuff. But there are these little So I think the confluence of those things over hundreds of years, my guess is that is what makes that magical realism happen, and that's why I think that it is something that belongs to Latin American cultures. Again,
and the merging, right? Like the merging of all that, everybody's different stories and different traditions and different oral stories and folk tales and whatever, all of that kind of merging together as well, and kind of changing and blending, and then what survives throughout the years and is then kind of continues on and on. So
I just want to say that I think that was a really great answer from both of you, and I just want to add just a little teeny bit there, which is to say that magical realism is believed to have been started in terms of literature with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who Bob just mentioned, and his novel 100 Years of Solitude. But absolutely, I agree with everything that you guys are saying in terms of this, colonial consequences in the culture and how it is that we have these different elements. And again, really very different in different countries, but it still has the same sort of essence, if you will. So
Carlos has a
really
question.
Nice question, Danielle.
Carlos, you had a question too?
Yes. Well, basically what I want to say is that your answers were very helpful, because I can see the parallels between what you just said with colonialism and indigenous cultures and so forth, and this oppression in the ghost dancers in the Pine Ridge area, the native U.S. natives. They really believe that it became kind of some people may call it a cult, but they started to believe that if they this dance and without stopping and so forth, that the white man would disappear, right, and would go away, and they really truly believe that. But that's it's a result of this relationship, this uneven relationship, which is almost like a science fiction in of itself, like Martians coming, and it's they're so incredibly powerful in comparison to the group that's being invaded, And they come up with all kinds of ways of trying to survive, and even to the point of believing deeply that by doing this dance and not stopping, and some people would just simply collapse dead because they would not stop. And I see a lot of parallels there. But I had one other point, and that is, how do you see this translating to the screen? And I'm thinking of one particular novel that I made the mistake of watching the film first before watching the novel, and I was totally confused. And I don't remember the title of it, but I do remember as a scene, there's a couple having sex on a bed, and suddenly the room starts to catch fire, and they're not moving away. And they're not
like water for chocolate.
Yeah,
water for chocolate. Get the hell out of there, you know. And nothing happens. And then I read the novel, Las Llamaradas del Amor, The Flames of Love. And I said, okay, now I get it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think, you know, like how Alex was saying, when you have these uneven systems like of oppression and of the oppressor and the oppressed, right, there is going to be, like you were saying, Carlos, is desperate need to believe in something, and nothing is out of the realm of possibility, you know, and so it also becomes the survival kind of tactic in many ways.
Yeah.
Bill, did you have a
Very
question?
helpful. Very helpful.
Bill, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand up.
Well, yes, thank you. I'm thinking through what I'm hearing, and this is such a wonderful presentation. Thank you for being with us today. And you're making us think a lot, which is such a great thing. So 100 Years of Solitude begins and ends with a baby who is born with the tail of a pig, right? But if you think about it, that could have meaning that isn't magical realism, but could be on that cusp, right? So to the casual reader, it's somebody born with an oddity, but it could be something real like spina bifida, right? But it's calling it the tail of a pig is a way to explain what it is. Mm. And I think that this is the strength of magical realism in literature, because it opens the windows, and you just use the term realm of possibility, and that's something I had jotted down in my notes. It opens our minds actually to ideas. How we explain things allows us to maybe to comprehend the reality that we're experiencing. And when you use magical realism gently, it doesn't seem like something bizarre that you now have to just accept so the story can go on. It gently pulls you into a realm of possibility. I've taken students for many years to Guatemala, where they have met a comadrona, traditional birth attendant or midwife, who explains to them that she learned everything that she needed to know about her work from dreams. And this is an odd thing for people who are getting master's degrees, who put a lot of faith in formal education. But I prepare them and ask them actually to be open-minded, and they leave that encounter with her really believing that it is possible, that she received all of the knowledge that she needed through her dreams. And so you have these realms of reality and magic coming together, right? And magic is just, sometimes we see it as just illusion, but sometimes it is a way of explaining. And so what I think is that this is very, very powerful for young people, because it does take them into that, as you said, realm of possibility, to accept that maybe the world is a little bit different from the way that they perceive it based on everything they've been told, right? The way that they've been told to perceive the world. And that maybe if they stretch themselves, they won't encounter magic, but they will encounter different ways of thinking. And if they're open to that, then that brings us together as humanity. See this as a beautiful vehicle for teaching and learning. And that's what I'm hearing as I listen to you. And thank you very, very much.
Bill, I would even say that speculative fiction as well, which is not Latin American, but I think belongs to everybody, is also does a similar thing in that it opens up that realm of possibility, and it allows you to explore themes that are happening in your world right now and possibly to you, but from a remove of something that is sort of, as I say, removed, so it's not actually happening right now. And I'm thinking of like Margaret Atwood and all those sort of speculative fiction writers that are really writing about futurism, but really they're really writing about right now. So I think, like N.K. Jemisin, there's this future looking, and there might be different cultures, there might be even other worlds, or there might be this world with extra technology, but all those things, the purpose of those literary devices is to deepen the contrast between the mundane world and the world of possibilities, while laser focusing on the things, the very real topics and the very real things that the author wants you to focus on that are happening right now.
May I say one more thing in response to your comment, which is that perhaps there's a little bit of literary sleight of hand that happens very constructively in taking people into an alternative context, so that they can think about things without being burdened by all of their biases that immediately snap into action when they try to think about those things within their own cultural experience. But if you can pull them out into that alternative context, then there's a possibility that they can see things differently. And then when they come back into their own context, bring those lessons with them.
Yeah, I love that.
Danielle put a great question in the chat. Danielle, do you want to ask it? Do you want me to read it?
I guess I could read it.
Thank you.
I said, as far as the elements of immigration that you both touch on in your books, how do you think that your novels can help children that haven't lived that reality develop more empathy and understanding for peers that might have gone through these situations, but they might not personally know?
I mean, I think that that's exactly what it does. I think that teens and young readers, that empathy is going to kick in. I think a lot of times they just don't know the depth of something on a very personal level. And I think a book can make it personal. I truly, truly believe that a book can make something very personal to a reader. And so then it does feel like they do know Pulga, and they do know Pequeña, and they do know Chico. And now all of a sudden, these are people, yes, they're characters in this fiction book, but these are people that they now know, and that they now have seen with their family, and that they now know where they come from, and that they now know have the real dangers that they face, and so then that just kind of naturally begins to develop this intimacy with them and this friendship with them, and then this, hopefully by the end, this empathy of like, wow, I did not realize what young immigrants in other countries were really facing, because they are looking through Twitter as well at the 2-minute news stories, and things are made so small and consumable for our teens right now. And so, when you give them something that asks them to take the time and space, then I think that they naturally do kind of are open to that and open to that empathy.
Yeah, and I think another sort of sleight of hand trick that novelists use is making our stories extremely specific and making our characters specific. And that is almost counterintuitive, because you think, well, if you make them more generic and general, more people can identify with them. But actually, with Jenny's case of the Pulga, Pequeña, y Chico, their relationship is so specific. Their friend dynamic is so specific. but it's also something that you look at and you go and you understand it. Any child would understand the dynamics of, like, you know, Pulga taking care of Chico, Chico protecting, you know, the whole, you see it and you understand it immediately. So that is a way in that immediately engenders empathy, because they're like, oh, this kind of friend, I have this kind of friend, I am this kind of friend, I have this kind of family member. So that specificity really is a gateway to empathy. And I also think, as I was talking about before, intersectionality when we're talking about identities is extremely important too, because maybe you are a person who's reading it is not an immigrant and their family has been in this country for you know, hundreds of years, but maybe they are in the closet and they don't know how to be themselves, and that is a point of empathy. Or it might be that they have had mental illness and depression, and they don't know how to speak about that, and then they see someone else in the book that also has trouble speaking about that. So those are all points of entry to, as Jenny was saying, you know, the point is to create empathy, not just for immigrants, but for everyone.
Yeah.
Diane, do you want to ask your question? Diane, you made a comment.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think the authors sort of responded to, but it was in piggyback to the question of building empathy with your story or narratives. I often wonder if that can be done independent of facilitation, you know, to bring in the reader. Does there have to, I mean, you answered by saying no, that you engage the reader automatically connects because they have a story that they can relate to, a personal story that is similar. Or, but I question though, and maybe I'm looking at it from a college student perspective, which is what I've taught more at that level, and find that you can provide a great story and they can connect with it, but building empathy and understanding, that's a skill set too. They can relate to the story, but building that empathy to imagine the struggle and pain, I question if that can be done independent, and maybe in the experiences I've had with students that I've worked with, but I appreciate a good story is a good story, and a good story, you should be able to make it relatable to other experiences. So that was the question of, I mean, building empathy it's a lifelong learning experience. So.
And Carmen and I have talked about using these works in teaching, right? It's all a process.
Yes, yes.
I think to answer your question, that it can happen without facilitation, but I think that if there is a place to discuss, then that empathy grows, you know, but and can be deepened. But I think it absolutely can be sparked, and it does hit many young readers, you know. It can happen. I think it just can grow from there. And absolutely, when teachers tell me that they're reading this book, and, you know, they tell me about the conversations that they're having in class, and when I have teenagers who send me emails and tell me, you know, how this has touched them or impacted them or made them think about these issues more, or made them go talk to family, you know, to find out their own immigration stories, I think that we begin to we see how it's being built.
And I think that both of our books are not only for children.
Right. I always say young readers because, you know, I'm thinking of it as young adult book, but yes.
I think there's the teaching of empathy, but there's also the awakening of empathy, and I think that happens with older readers. I've had that experience with my book where people have said, yes, I knew about this, you know, the immigration problem, and I had read about that or seen it in the news, but I had never focused on the humanness and the real experiences of individuals and what that would feel like. And going through Marisol's story and understanding, this is a fictional character, but understanding that those real relationships and all of the tiny choices that lead to these situations awoke empathy in me. I've had that comment from people. So I think, I agree with Jenny that it doesn't need to be facilitated. It can happen on its own, because sometimes that empathy is dormant, or it might be dormant for a specific group of people that a person has never thought about, because they've never been exposed to that. So I think that there's a lot of ways that it can be, empathy can be. So to say taught makes it sound like you didn't have any and now you do, but it's a process, and it is sort of like an expansion and a deepening, and it happens in a lot of different directions.
Can I build on this and ask you to kind of think a little bit about what it is that you wanted your young readers and maybe adult readers to come away from the books thinking about Central America, and also thinking about the United States and sort of the relationship between the United States and Central America?
I can go first if you want, Jenny, or
Sure.
okay. I think that I wanted people to think about the relationship between the individual characters, and then further think about the power that each of those individual characters had in their world. So the adults in Ray's life, the family members who can make this happen and sort of move mountains to try to get their beloved child help. The different levels of what the kinds of immigrants and even the privilege that different immigrant groups have, and then also the people who, the family members, like Marisol's family members in El Salvador, and the power that some have and that some don't, and also power by association, because Marisol's family Marisol herself has privilege because she speaks English. Mm-hmm. So, and that was from a family association. So I wanted people to think about all of those things. Well, no, that's not true. I wanted them to think about Marisol, Gabby, and Ray, a family story and a love story and the story of self-discovery. But coming out through that, sort of radiating out through that, I wanted all those other pieces to be there so that they could see Ray's family, Ray's dad, and Indrani, and the people who are trying to help her, and also Ray's friends, that their reality is a million miles away from Marisol's reality. And but it's still their reality. It's still how they see the world. So I wanted to juxtapose these many faceted different worlds together. And I wanted it all to seem very real so that they could understand Ray. And I don't think anyone has told, so a couple of people are like, well, she complains a lot, compared to what Marisol is going through. But I think that people understand where she's coming from, because she only knows her world. So I wanted to, I guess, this is a very long-winded way of saying I wanted there to be space for many different people to approach this story.
And I'm sorry, someone speaking? No. I just really wanted people to think about unaccompanied minors more, and to really try to imagine that reality, and not only the circumstances that they're fleeing, but also the circumstances that they're fleeing in the midst of childhood, in the midst of this moment in their lives where they're young and they're innocent and they are already powerless, right? Because to be a child is in many ways in society to be powerless and to always be being told what to do. And I just really wanted to put a magnifying glass up to that and make these characters become as real to the reader as possible, and as personal to the reader as possible. And I really wanted people also to think of government and the relationship between the US and Central America, and even the relationship between neighboring countries in Central America, because those are huge things, right? That I wasn't going out to write a history book, but I wanted to insert into the book so that hopefully people would go and seek more information and try to understand how, US intervention has disrupted Central America and how we still see the trickling effects of that even today. So it's not just kind of like, oh, well, what's going on in Central America today? It's this huge history of what has been happening and what governments have been being overthrown that have caused over decades, and over many years, the problems that Central America faces today. And to be honest about that, and then to be honest about, how US intervention has caused those problems, and now we turn our back on the people that those things have affected, and then even with like Mexico and Central America and Guatemala, how, because there's a point where Purga says, we, as in him and Chico being Guatemalan, we are to Mexico what Mexico is to the United States. So there's all these power structures at place, and I just wanted people to think about that a little bit more.
Wow.
But while also focusing on, the very real personal relationship with the three characters who, for me, were always the main thing. I wanted them to be at the forefront of the book and everything else to be, kind of the backdrop, but something that you saw and looked into.
Bob, do you have a question?
Sort of. My grandparents came over in 1890 from Italy. They were 14 years old, and they landed at Ellis Island, and then and somehow they ended up in Stratford, Connecticut, right? And they had my mom, and I was wondering, it'd be interesting if there was a book written, like the first chapter would be what you would write, and the second chapter would be their story. Coming over and to see that it's the same story, as far as the people and their rights to what's happening. It just shocked me that like I'm here because of that. Otherwise I wouldn't be. So I don't know if that's been done or could be done or.
Well, I think that that's a reason that I wrote my story too, not only to bear witness in this moment, but so that there's not this forgetting, right? Which is so, like, this is what happens. People forget that within their family, there was their own immigration story that was from, however many people before their generation. But that's what I want to I guess, put out there in the world to try to make that forgetting less with anybody who encounters this book, and to, within my own community, as well as other communities, and to reflect, like, we are not from here. Where are we all from? And, where do we all start, and where do all of our stories start? So.
I want to ask Alex a question, actually, because Alex, you brought up, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, Andrade, is that?
Andrade, yep.
So for me, this was actually a really fascinating character in your book, and she's essentially the person that gets Marisol and Gabby in contact with Ray to put on the cuff. And she is, I'm assuming, an Indian immigrant. And so she's sort of got this middling role. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about why it is you chose for her to be an immigrant, because you did mention her just now, so that's why.
Yeah, I mean, I did that purposefully because I think that it's really important to know that, and we again talk about this when we're talking about the Latinx diaspora, we're not all the same. We don't treat each other the same. There is racism, there is colorism, there is, there are so many things within our communities. And there's even, like, would you call it countryism, where some countries are just seen as better than other countries within Latin America. I've even had the experience of speaking Spanish with other people and having somebody say, oh, but your Spanish is so much prettier than mine. And I'm like, first of all, I grew up in New Jersey. It is not. But secondly, you know, the idea of that someone else's language is somehow more correct, I think is some BS. Obviously, I think that, but you know, so I think that I wanted to highlight a little bit that for all intents and purposes, and in the end, there is some sort of some, not all, but some redemption for Indrani and for Ray's father, but not. It's not like it's immigrants are good guys and everyone else is a bad guy. There is nuance, and there are people who will, you know, who will turn around, and it goes a little bit to what Bob was saying about everyone's story as being as an immigrant. A lot of people's stories are immigrants. We're all immigrants to this country, right? And that forgetting is part of saying, oh, not me. I'm not like that, or I did it the right way, or I did it, you know, all these qualifiers that take you away from this other group so that you're not like them. So Indrani was my attempt to bring those, to weave those things in.
Yeah, and just to like kind of piggyback on that, Alex, this kind of this thing that can happen, you know, of the forgetting or being like, well, we are past that moment. So now, you know, kind of like then generalizing that everybody should be past that moment to when, you know, we have children arriving at the US southern border unaccompanied, and then somebody, you know, 3 generations removed from that immigration story is like, well, aren't we done talking about this? No, we're not done talking about this, because this is a relevant issue always, you know. So yes, it's not about, oh, all immigrants are good and everybody else is bad. There's so many things happening within you know, within our communities. Yeah.
Anybody else have other questions? Because Carmen and I have a whole big list, so we can be here till midnight.
I just have a real.
I will stay.
I have a question for Jenny. There's 2 words, Polga. And
I'm sorry?
Pequeña, P-E-Q,
Pequeña?
and Polka. It seems to run throughout the book. What do they mean?
Small.
Pulga.
Yes,
Pulga.
both of them are just words.
Well, pulga means flea.
Pulga means
Flea.
flea, and pequeña means small one for a woman or a girl.
And it seems like it goes back and forth.
That's their names. Those are the
Yes.
characters' names. That is a big thing in Latin American culture, where we get nicknames, and we usually get nicknames, not always, but sometimes like the opposite of what we are. So if you have a really skinny uncle, that's el gordo.
Gordo.
And if you have, you know, like, it's just, yeah, you have,
Yeah.
it's, I don't know, it's our sense of humor.
Do you have a middle a nickname, Alex?
Honestly, my sister used to call me a pulga, but she was mad at me, so she was in.
Oh, you were a pest.
It was like, "Vete pulga," like, get out of here, you little pest. You know. I don't have a nickname. Do you?
I do. My whole family calls me Oso, bear.
I love it. It's so perfect for you.
Also, and not even Osa, you know, like Oso,
Yeah.
like they use the male.
Male.
Because but in my case, it was because of the way that I was as a teenager. I was so kind of like rough and tumble, you know, like if there was something that I could possibly break, I would be the one who broke it, you know. So they just, they called me, they started calling me that probably when I was about 10 years old. And I was like, Oso.
I love that. I love that for you.
So yeah, I felt like I had to add the nicknames just because, not only because of what, you know, they symbolize, what they signify, but also because it is so part of our culture.
It is.
You know, everybody, all my kids have nicknames, all my little nephews and nieces have nicknames. So.
Wow, thank you.
Carmen, can I ask a question? I know we both have, because we've talked about this before. So I teach history of science sometimes, and Alex, reading your book, it's such a powerful work, but encased in this story that you can get really wrapped into. But I was struck by the sort of the bioethical implications of this, and you've touched on it a little bit. So that's one thing. And then you've also touched on this, and that was, you know, Ray doesn't want, you mentioned this before, Ray doesn't want to give up her grief, or it takes a while before she agrees. But Marisol has had to live with this grief, and then she has to live with her grief and Ray's grief. And I remember thinking, is there an indication that because of everything that she's had to go through, Marisol, that she has a resilience that Ray does not have? And is that some sort of commentary on, you know, US?
So at first, I mean, I had to write down the first one because I think I'll do that one last, the bioethical questions brought up.
Yeah.
So the idea of immigrants being resilient, to me, is a problematic idea. Sure, lots of people and lots of immigrants are resilient, but there's this expectation that because of their resilience, that they can take on more burdens. And it is an internalized expectation that a lot of immigrants and immigrants families, you know, like kids of immigrants, like Jenny and I are, also have, that our expectation of what we can take and do and should be able to take and do is higher than Americans, right? Than los Americanos, because we owe a debt to our parents who came and what they sacrificed. They showed this extraordinary resilience in whatever way that they did, and we can only do that as a minimum. So I kind of bristle a little bit at the yes, Marisol is resilient, but I also feel like she has been, that label has been put on her as something that she has to do as a minimum, and there's gross unfairness to put that on a 17-year-old child. And one of the things, this is me getting on my soapbox, I knew it was going to happen tonight, here I am. One of the consequences of that is that in our immigrant, in our marginalized communities, that expectation of resilience turns out to mean that we are not able to express that we need help, and we're not able to ask for help, and we are not even able to admit that we have mental health struggles. So there's lots of studies that I can't even cite right now because I don't have it in front of me, that show that specifically to Latinx communities in America, and specifically to teen girls who are Latinx, that their struggle to have good mental health is so difficult for them because of this expectation of resilience, coupled with all of the other expectations of performing womanhood and like a ton of other things. So I have no idea if I answered your question, but I did want to bring up the idea of resilience when you're talking about an immigrant. It is something that we internalize. It is something that is also put on us by the society that we're in. And it is tricky. It's problematic. Of course, we want to be resilient, but we don't want to not be able to be vulnerable, not be able to ask for help, not be able to be seen as someone who can have mental health issues and not be stigmatized for those things. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
If I could comment real quickly, Alex, it's very tiring being so resilient.
Yes, it really is, because you feel like you don't have a choice, but also you know, it would be nice to have that choice. And it's coming from inside the house. I'm not saying it's also the call is coming from inside the house. That's a horror movie reference for anyone who doesn't know. We're getting it from our communities inside, and then we're getting it from outside communities too, who might be like, oh, but you know, you were so strong and you can take it. And that is in essence what is what Marisol is told, even not explicitly. And she agrees. So she's told, you can do this. Poor Ray has suffered so much, but you have suffered and you can take her suffering too because you're resilient.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think it's like what you said, it's trying to meet the standards of two different cultures, right? And not like trying to juggle those two things and not being able to ask for help, because on one side, oh, you're resilient, and on the other side, you know, you need to amount to this because we did so much for you, you know, to get you to this point where you don't have to go through the same things that we had to go through, like with our parents. And it's one of the main reasons that, you know, without giving too much away, but with why Chico's narrative is what Chico's narrative is, because I wanted to be very honest that, you know, and in this kind of situation, you know, no matter what you may believe about resilience or who needs to be resilient, the fact is that, you know, these immigrant children are vulnerable. And, you know, there needs to be honesty about that, and a willingness to talk about that, and a willingness to show that, even if it makes people have to grapple with things that they don't necessarily want to think about or deal with.
Bill, did you want to say something?
Well, just from the other side of that coin, I think assigning to people the quality of resilience is a way of excusing oneself from feeling sympathy, right? I don't need to feel sympathy because, or you know, even better, empathy, because you're resilient, you can handle it, and essentially you're on your own, right? So it becomes a way not to feel somebody else's pain by giving them this superpower. So you don't really need to have feelings about their suffering,
or to help. I don't need to help.
Right.
Great, I'm glad I asked the question. So now the bioethical implications.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's when I go to school visits, a lot of the teachers do ask the kids the question, like, if this technology were real, would you use it? And it's you know, if for younger kids, middle school kids, it's usually like, no, that's just terrible. And then when you get to older kids, like, you know, 11th grade, 12th grade, and even some college, there'll be more of a discussion of like, but what if it could save somebody's life? What if somebody was in such a, like, what if somebody, unlike Marisol, maybe didn't have such a burden and could take it on? I mean, would it be? And they agreed, and sort of, so it brings up all of these, like, what are the ethics around it, and what is, you know, and ultimately I let everybody talk, and then I'm like, well, who owns this technology and how are they making money? And then suddenly that's why it's no good. Because somebody is making a profit and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I think that that's ultimately how I answer that, the ethics question, because it's an interesting question of like, well, what if there could be a fair exchange? Someone could exchange what they see as their resilience and give it to someone else who does not have the resilience. And could that exchange ever be fair? And there are many questions about who has what privilege and what support systems that they have, and then ultimately who's making money off of a technology like that.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Comments?
I have a question for Jenny. So one thing that I was really interested in is that you have 2 of the 3 characters make it to the United States. But in the end, they're separated. and we don't ever see them reunited. And I'm just wondering why you decided to have them separated, what the, because they were so closely knit, if you will, up until then.
I wanted that to mimic the separation that so many families suffer when they get to the U.S. southern border, and how many times the unaccompanied children who arrive with family members are not allowed to stay with those family members. Boys are separated from girls. They are sent to different detention centers. So I wanted for each, as hard as it was, I wanted for each of those characters to be very alone in that moment, this moment where they finally get to, the United States, and the challenges they don't become any easier. And I wanted the reader to really feel that and really understand that. And I wanted, the narrative, I have Pulga's voice and Pequeña's voice in there because I really also wanted readers to reflect on how different it would be for a female or female identifying character going through this journey and the different dangers that Pequeña faces just because of her gender, and what she encounters at the border from the Border Patrol agent who captures her or tries to capture her. So just to, I guess, emphasize that loneliness, that separation, that isolation, and that fear of the unknown, having them be by themselves.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Well, I have a comment.
Sure.
During COVID, I continue to belong to a book club, but we read Into the Beautiful North by Luis Alberto Urrea. And I was wondering, were you influenced by that book? Is it? I really enjoyed it, and the whole group really enjoyed it. And I was just curious as to, and that's why when I saw this book, I said, "Oh, I have to read it." Is it?
Personally, I have not read that book, so I don't know it. I'm not familiar with the story that's happening there. But when I was younger, there was a movie called El Norte that I watched with my family, and it really impacted me as a child. And I think that's why, not only is this story personal because of my family and where my family is from, but also because that movie, when I was younger, was one that I remember sparking that empathy in me and people's immigration journeys.
Well, this was kind of based on the Magnificent Seven. Do you remember the movie Magnificent Seven? When you had all these Americans come down and they free this village, and this group of young men and women in this town in Mexico, I guess it's further down than Mexico. They decide to go up, and they're gonna get a bunch of bandidos to come down and free their village. And it was I thought it was a really interesting story. It was really, I guess in ways it's got humor to it. And so I'll be up tonight reading your book.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Carmen, do you have any other questions?
I have one more, but I'm not sure that it's really personally curious, and it's for Jenny as well, and it has to do with the story of the sisters. And what I mean there is you have one sister that's on the train line who is providing assistance to immigrants. And then we have another sister that's on the US side, and they both help Pequeña, and actually the one sister helps Chico as well. I'm just curious as to why it is you decided to have those two characters united by a familial bond.
I love that you remember those sisters because I love those sisters. I really wanted to, I guess, bring forth this idea of women helping women, of the sisterhood with women, of you know, wanting, and even in this kind of impossible way, because you know, Soledad is on the train line, like you said, and Marta's on this side of the border. I wanted to make sort of like the impossible possible, and this connection between women everywhere, and this love for one another. And so it made perfect sense to me that they would encounter one sister on their journey, and they would encounter one sister here once they have arrived. And so I really, and she's well, basically she is based on my mother-in-law, because I've had such powerful women in my life, such strong, powerful women in my life. And, you know, I've also seen women oppressed in my culture and in my family. And I wanted to kind of give them power in this book. And Marta is very much like my mother-in-law, because she lives my mother-in-law lives in New Mexico, and she lives right like 2 minutes away from my mother-in-law and father-in-law, near Palomas, Mexico. And so they, you know, she is one of a giving heart and would help anybody in distress and anybody who needed help. And so that's where I saw Pequeña landing, when she is helped by somebody. And also, just to go back to your previous question too, with the Pulga and Pequeña, when you said that we don't know what happens to them, because I have like this delayed reaction, sorry. You know, I really wanted to leave the reader there in that moment of uncertainty, because it is what so many migrants face, is this kind of existence that is in limbo. And I wanted to leave the reader there in that moment where you're not sure what's going to happen to them. They're not sure what's going to happen to them. Because I write for young adults, I do like to, you know, give as much hope as possible while still being very honest and realistic. So I like to leave them in this horizon of like hope, you know, there's possibility, there is hope, but also very much in this part of like just uncertainty.
So I just want to emphasize again that Carmen and I have talked about these books and how powerful they can be in a classroom, and not just in high school 7 through 12, which of course we train teachers, but also in our classrooms at the university level, because in addition to, you know, the historical narrative or maybe journal articles or other texts that we're using, I think you can really embrace these stories, and every student can relate to something, if not every aspect of it. And it just promotes a lot more discussion, I think, than it would for them reading, those of us professors sitting on this screen, you know, the kind of crickets that you get when you start, let's have a conversation about the journal article that I had you read. You know, what's the author's argument? What evidence is the author bringing? What primary sources? Whereas I think you can ease into that conversation because you have these books that are so powerful. And I mean, we just couldn't stop talking about them. So I thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for writing, and keep writing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Because, you know, I mean, for me, you know, I sit in this and I write this story, and I hope it goes out into the world, and I hope it impacts people. But I'm just at my desk writing this story by myself, you know? So knowing that there are educators out there who want to share it and who want to discuss it and who want to delve into it deeply and have these conversations is so meaningful to me as a writer. So thank you.
Yeah.
Same. Thank you. And also, I'm in my garden shed, so I'm even more isolated than Jenny. Jenny's at least in her house. I'm like in the back of the garden. But I think that another thing, you know, we're lucky too, because we have our community of Latinx authors. We belong to a collective called Las Musas. And so we have that community as well. And I think one of the most beautiful things about that community, other than being able to amplify each other and get more Latinx representation into the hands of kids, that is that we gain confidence to tell even more specific stories. Not that long ago when I started writing, this is my first book, but I've been writing for many years. I had an agent for many years, and you know, my stories, which did have Latinx protagonists, didn't sell for years. And I think that publishing is starting to change, but also we're having the courage to write our stories, the stories that we want to tell, and not necessarily put them through a lens that will maybe make it more, palatable, that's out the window, that we don't have to make it, because we're writing for kids, but we're writing for ourselves, you know? So like the next year, one of the things that I'm doing next year is to be part of an anthology of Latinx authors that are writing Latin American based horror stories and supernatural stories. Me
too.
Right. So, which I'm like, I cannot, the dream team that's happening for that book is incredible. And I think that I don't know if I would have had the courage to write a story like that a few years ago. That was so personal. And so, you know, I don't know, like maybe you have more coraje than I do, Jenny, but I don't know if I would have.
No, I mean, I wrote stories with, you know, Latinx protagonists before that have gone like ignored, you know, and I think that publishing is changing a bit now, you know, and like you said, you know, having a community, you know, really kind of helps that as well. So, but yeah, no, I think those stories have to be told, and they have to be written, and they have to be written many times. Right. Yep. There's this quote from, Valeria Luzueli, that I was reading, and it has to be told many times from many different perspectives to be understood.
Yeah.
I also want to thank you, Alex and Jenny, for having an email address that we could reach you directly. I mean, we understand that you have agents, but it was really nice to be able to reach out to you directly. And when Carmen and I started this, we really had no idea. We thought, well, will somebody respond? And we were just so fortunate that you both responded, and you could come the same day, and that you jive so well together. It was really, it was great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having us. And, you know, it's a joy to spend any time with Jenny, because she's an incredible author and just an amazing human. She has fantastic musical taste. And, you know, but I also, you know, when you reach out to us and I had a look at your website and some of the other things that you were doing, what I really loved is that you had a full complement of in-person and virtual events that you were doing for Latinx Hispanic Heritage Month. It wasn't sort of like here's our placeholder, you know, and that's really important to me as well, that you try to like encompass many aspects of Latinidad. So thank you for doing that.
Carmen, do you have any final words?
I just want to thank the two of you for, first off, writing beautiful, powerful novels. And second, for taking the time to come here and meet with us. It has been nothing short of an absolute treat. Thank you.